At his wife's funeral, Silas overhears his son whisper, "Now we just have to deal with the old man." Rain drifted across the white canopy like a thin veil, soft but unrelenting, tapping the canvas and the lacquered wood of the mahogany casket. Silas stood close enough to see the satin lining where Eleanor's hands were folded, the same hands that once kneaded dough and tied garden twine, now still beneath roses cut from the bush she loved. He had dressed carefully, yet the collar of his shirt felt too tight, and the sleeves of his old wool coat were heavy with water. People moved through the aisle in slow steps, their voices lowered, their eyes kind. They offered words about a life well lived and a love many envied. He thanked them with a nod and a quiet word, but his mind held on to that whisper like a thorn. Across the wet grass, Micah leaned toward Naomi. They did not look at the casket. They did not look at him. They looked instead at the line of trees where the cemetery ended and the roofline of the family house began to peek through, gray against the sky. Naomi's hair was perfect, a glossy dark wave that the rain did not dare to touch. Micah kept his hands in his pockets, as if the day were a business obligation, as if grief could be scheduled between meetings. A neighbor named Mary Henderson reached for Silas's arm. Her fingers were warm despite the damp air. She said Eleanor had baked the best pies on their block and had the tenderest laugh she had ever heard. Silas heard the words and wanted to hold them close, but the whisper echoed again. Now we just have to deal with the old man. He could almost feel the shape of each word settle into his chest. The minister concluded with a prayer, and the workers drew nearer with gentle shovels. The first dull thud of earth sounded, soft and final. Silas shut his eyes and let the sound pass through him. He pictured Eleanor in their kitchen in morning light, her apron dusted with flour, turning to him with that half-smile that said everything would be all right. When he opened his eyes, Naomi had lifted her phone, the screen bright against the gray day. Micah murmured to her, and they both looked toward the lane that led back to town. Silas stepped back from the casket, his shoes sinking into the soft ground. His hands trembled, but not from cold. He was thinking of Christmas mornings in the living room they had built with their own hands, of birthdays under strings of lights on the back deck, of summer evenings when crickets sang and Eleanor's roses opened like small suns. The house was not wood and nails to him. It was breath. It was the sound of Eleanor's voice drifting from the garden and the way sunlight made the hallway glow in late afternoon. He knew the creak of every board and the comfort of each window's view. He had promised Eleanor the house would always be their safe place. Micah's voice carried across the hush, too clear, too sharp. He said their father could not keep up a house that size, that it would be kinder to move him somewhere that had help on site. Naomi's answer was smooth as a polished stone. "Family comes first," she said, and the words landed wrong, a shape that did not fit the mouth that spoke them. Silas turned his face from them and looked at the name cut into stone. Eleanor. The letters were steady and sure. He traced them in his mind, letter by letter, and let the rain wash his cheeks so he did not have to wipe his eyes. When the crowd began to thin, Micah and Naomi stepped aside beneath a maple tree. Naomi gestured with 2 fingers toward the direction of home. Micah nodded as if closing a deal. Silas watched their silhouettes through the rain. He remembered a boy with a missing front tooth who had begged to help hold the level as they built a birdhouse together. He remembered the way that boy ran from the school bus and jumped the porch steps 2 at a time. He remembered a young man in a cap and gown who said he would make his parents proud. All of that lived inside the same body that now stood with a jaw set like stone, already charting his father's future without him. Mary came back with a paper cup of hot coffee and pressed it into his hand. It warmed his fingers and did not warm him. She said she would stop by tomorrow with a casserole and check on his garden. He thanked her by name, asked after her sister, and watched her leave beneath an umbrella with a blue border. He felt a sudden ache, not only for Eleanor, but for simple decency, for a time when presents meant something and phones stayed in pockets when love was being lowered into the earth. The funeral director spoke in a careful tone about the ride back to the house, about flowers that could be taken by family, about the guest book that would be moved indoors. Silas nodded. The words floated past him. The world seemed to have slipped half an inch out of place. He told himself to breathe, to take one step and then another, to let the minutes do their quiet work until they could carry him into the evening. Micah approached at last, Naomi a single step behind. For a heartbeat, Silas thought he saw the lines of the boy he had raised tug at the corners of his son's mouth. Then Micah's gaze shifted toward the lane again, and the moment was gone. He said they would stop by the house soon to talk through next steps. Naomi added that it would be best to act quickly while everything was fresh. Silas stared at the damp earth and saw Eleanor's yellow roses laid there, bright against the dark soil. He answered that today was for goodbye. He said nothing more. They left in a hurry, their dark clothes neat, their umbrellas held at the same angle, their heads close together. Silas stood alone beneath the edge of the canopy. The rain slowed to a mist that made every surface shine. He took one last look at Eleanor's name, and then at the roses, and then at the sky, which was trying to brighten but could not quite manage it. He turned and walked the path toward the gate, each step feeling both too heavy and too light. At the car, he paused with his hand on the door handle. He looked back over his shoulder as if expecting Eleanor to call his name from the path, to tell him he had forgotten his scarf, or to remind him to pick up milk at the corner store. The quiet answered instead. He slid behind the wheel and sat for a long, still minute with the engine off, the rain ticking on the windshield like a soft metronome. He placed both hands on the steering wheel to steady them and whispered a thank you that he did not say out loud at the graveside. He promised her, as he had promised her many times, that their home would remain their home. When he finally started the car, the heater sighed and sent warm air over the glass. Through the blur, he saw the cemetery workers fold the canopy, their careful movements respectful and unhurried. He watched until the white fabric disappeared and the casket sat in the open day. He thought of the porch light that had always been left on when someone in the family had to come home late. He thought of that glow on rainy nights. He thought of the way Eleanor always believed there was a way through any trouble that kept a person decent. He drove out to the road and turned toward the neighborhood where their house waited. The lane curved, and the trees leaned in, and the rain softened to a silver thread. On another day, he would have noticed how the grass along the ditch turned the freshest green after a storm. Today he kept his eyes forward. At a long stoplight, he reached to adjust the vent and caught his own reflection in the dark glass. He saw a man who had outlived the love of his life, a father who had heard a sentence he could not unhear. He could feel the shape of what tomorrow would bring. They would arrive with firm voices and tight smiles. They would carry papers and talk about practicality and how much easier things would be if he let go of the past. He could feel the pressure of their plans settling around him like a net. He sat with that feeling and did not run from it. He let his breath slow. He stared down the road until the light changed, and then he drove home to a house that still held the scent of Eleanor's lavender and the soft echo of her steps in the hall. He parked beneath the maple in front, turned off the engine, and sat in the quiet that follows a storm. The porch light, on from morning, glowed faintly under its glass. He would go inside. He would set the kettle on. He would stand where the kitchen window faced east, the way she wanted. He would remember, and he would gather himself for what must come next. Tomorrow, they will come with their demands. But tonight, I grieve not only my wife, but the son I have already lost. Silas woke before the sun, the house still wrapped in silence. The old clock in the hallway ticked with the same rhythm it had kept for decades. He lay still, listening to the faint creaks of the rafters above him, the way the boards shifted as if remembering the years gone by. The bed beside him was cold, and for a moment he almost turned, ready to greet Eleanor, before memory struck again. The ache pressed on him like the weight of the quilts. He rose slowly, his knees stiff, and shuffled into the kitchen where the faint scent of lavender still lingered in the curtains. The kitchen table was marked with scratches from homework nights, Sunday puzzles, and cups of coffee set down too quickly. He ran his palm across the surface and remembered Eleanor's laughter when Micah, as a child, spilled milk all over the table and tried to clean it with paper napkins. The boy's eyes had been wide with guilt until Eleanor pulled him close and said it was only milk, not the end of the world. That table had seen everything. Birthdays with candles burning low, Eleanor's pies cooling on wire racks, neighbors stopping by for advice or a slice of cake. He walked to the window above the sink, where morning light always came soft and golden. Outside, the garden waited in stillness. The rose bushes Eleanor had planted bloomed defiantly, their petals heavy with dew. Each rose had a story. She used to say the yellow ones carried joy, the red ones remembered love, and the pale pink blossoms held quiet forgiveness. Silas touched the glass and whispered her name, letting the sight steady him. The garden was hers, but it was also his, a map of every season they had weathered together. Later in the morning, the doorbell rang. A neighbor, Frank Miller, stood with a covered dish. He spoke gently, said the whole town was grieving with him. Frank remembered the nights Eleanor sang in the church choir, her voice carrying through the wooden beams. Silas thanked him, accepted the casserole, and tried to smile. After Frank left, Silas placed the dish on the counter and stared at it, realizing the kitchen would never again be filled with Eleanor's own cooking. He lifted the lid, breathed in the warmth, and sat down at the table, not because he was hungry, but because eating seemed to honor the kindness of a neighbor. The day stretched out, marked by small tasks. He gathered mail from the porch, each envelope a reminder of life's ongoing demands. He folded laundry, still finding one of Eleanor's scarves mixed in. Holding it, he remembered the time she wore it to a county fair, laughing as the wind tugged at her hat while they shared fried dough under strings of colored lights. The scarf smelled faintly of her perfume, and he pressed it to his face until his eyes blurred. In the afternoon, Silas wandered into the living room. Family photos lined the mantel. There was one of Micah as a boy, holding a fishing pole taller than himself, grinning proudly beside the river. Another showed Eleanor in the garden, dirt on her hands, pride in her smile. Silas stood before the pictures, tracing the edges of the frames. He remembered how much love had filled the rooms, how many ordinary days had been lifted into something sacred just by Eleanor's presence. But the memory of yesterday's whisper returned, cold and cutting. Now we just have to deal with the old man. The words clashed with every memory. He could not reconcile the child he had raised with the man who spoke so callously. Silas sank into Eleanor's old armchair, the one she claimed each evening with her knitting. He let the chair hold him, and in the quiet, he tried to understand where he had lost his son. Was it ambition? The hunger for more? Or had he, as a father, failed to remind Micah that love was stronger than wealth? As dusk drew near, Silas turned on the porch light. The glow spilled across the steps the way it always had, a sign that someone was waiting, that the door would open for family. He sat with a cup of tea, steam curling upward, and watched as the first stars pricked through the darkening sky. The house hummed softly around him, alive with the echoes of laughter, prayers, and arguments long past. It was more than shelter. It was memory made solid, love woven into wood and stone. Losing it would be like losing Eleanor all over again. He whispered to the night, to her, to himself, "This home will stay ours. Whatever comes, I will keep it safe." He did not yet know how, but he felt the promise rise steady within him. The light on the porch burned like a sentinel, and in its glow, he gathered strength for the storm that was sure to come. Morning came heavy and gray, the light slow to find the kitchen window that faced east just the way Eleanor wanted. Silas stood at the sink while the kettle began to murmur. The porch boards were still slick from last night's rain, and the maple dripped steadily, each drop a soft tap in the quiet. He remembered the promise he made in the car after the burial. Tomorrow, they will come. The house waited with him, the clock ticking, the scent of coffee grounds opening in the air. The doorbell rang before the kettle reached a full boil. The sound cut through the house with a bright insistence that felt out of place. Silas wiped his hands on a towel and walked the length of the hallway. Through the glass, he saw Micah and Naomi standing close together on the porch. Micah's coat was dark and perfect. Naomi's heels made her stand a little taller than memory. Neither of them looked uncertain. Neither of them looked like people making a condolence call. Silas opened the door and stepped back, meaning to invite them in, but Micah moved first, crossing the threshold like he had an appointment and the host was late to greet him. Naomi followed, eyes roaming over the entryway, pausing on Eleanor's framed cross-stitch with the words, "Bless this home." She tilted her head, as if considering where new paint would go. "We need to talk about the house," Micah said, his voice even and practiced. He did not ask if his father had slept. He did not ask if breakfast had been eaten. He opened a leather folder and set it on the hall table like a salesman who had long ago learned to close doors with documents. Naomi offered a smile that did not touch her eyes. "This can be simple and dignified, Silas. My family is prepared to make a generous offer. $5,000 and a lovely apartment at Sunset Manor. They have a community room, a courtyard, and on-site care. It is the sensible option for a man on his own." $5,000, Silas repeated, as if making sure he had heard correctly. He rested a hand on the back of the chair in the front room, because the world had tilted again and needed righting. The number sat between them like an insult spoken too softly to shout down. "The roof is old," Micah continued, flipping to a page in his folder. "The plumbing is dated. Taxes are set to rise. We are helping you avoid a burden. A quick sale means you can settle into a place equipped for your needs without headaches. We just need your signature, and we can begin the transition today." Naomi moved to the mantel and glanced at the photographs there as if considering lot lines and appraisals. "The market in this corridor is softening," she said. "Any delay reduces value further. The kindest thing for everyone is to move quickly." Silas walked to the kitchen and turned off the kettle before it screamed. He poured water over the coffee grounds, letting the steam curl, letting the familiar act slow his breathing. He set 3 mugs on the table because hospitality was not a switch he knew how to turn off. He placed a sugar bowl in the center because Eleanor always had, and only then did he speak. "This house is not a burden," he said. His voice was calm and low. "It is my home. I built it with my own hands. I lived a life here with your mother. It is not something to be cleared out like a storage unit." Micah sat, crossing one leg over the other, the folder open like a prop. "You are 70 years old, Dad. No one expects you to manage a place this size. We can save you the trouble and put real money in your pocket. We have already talked to Sunset Manor. They can have a room ready by the end of the week." Naomi did not sit. She leaned a hip against the counter and watched him the way a buyer watches an owner who does not understand the market. "My father has relationships that smooth these processes," she said. "A judge who owes a favor, a council member with vision for development. If you insist on clinging to an outdated structure, there are other avenues. Code enforcement is very strict these days." She smiled, bright and brittle. "None of that would be pleasant for you." Silas took a slow sip of coffee. He tasted the bitter and the heat. He kept his gaze on his son. Micah's jaw was set, the same way it was set when he was 6, and trying not to cry after falling off his bike. Silas remembered the small hand in his own, the way he had said, "I have you." He remembered a Sunday morning when a flour-dusted apron brushed his arm, and Eleanor laughed at something he could not now recall. Those memories did not leave room for panic. They steadied him the way a handrail steadies a steep stair. "You brought me an offer on the morning after your mother's funeral," he said. "You brought threats into her kitchen." He tapped the folder with one finger and slid it back across the table. "That is not how family behaves. I am not selling my home. I am not leaving it." Micah's patience thinned at the edges. He spoke carefully, each word measured. "Sentiment does not pay for repairs. Sentiment does not handle tax increases. We are trying to prevent a crisis that will fall on me anyway when something goes wrong here. Let us do the practical thing." "There is nothing practical about cruelty," Silas answered. "I will not sign." Naomi's smile vanished. Her voice cooled. Then you should understand what comes next. Our patience is a gift. It can be withdrawn. Processes can be slow and expensive. Legal notices can pile high. She reached for the leather folder as if to protect it from the spill she wished would happen. Silas stood. The chair legs touched back against the floor with a small sound that seemed louder for the quiet in the room. This is my house. You are here as my guests. You will not threaten me in my own kitchen. He gestured toward the front hall, his palm open, polite to the last inch. This conversation is over. Micah did not move at first. He looked around the room, at the sun through the window, at the sugar bowl that Eleanor had placed there for years, at the mug his father had set for him without thinking. He seemed for a heartbeat younger, uncertain. Then the hardness returned. He gathered the folder and stood. You have 48 hours to accept the offer, he said. After that, things get complicated. Naomi smoothed her sleeve. 48 hours, she repeated, as if marking the deadline on a calendar only she could see. Silas walked them to the door. He opened it and let the morning light in. The maple dripped. The porch boards shone. He did not slam the door behind them. He closed it with the care he used on the day they brought the crib through this same frame. In the silence that followed, he heard the clock in the hall and the faint hiss of the kettle cooling. He stood at the window and watched his son and daughter-in-law cross the yard without looking back. When the car pulled away, he turned and rested his hand on the kitchen table. The wood was warm where the mugs had sat. He drew a slow breath and felt something settle inside him, a quiet resolve that did not announce itself but filled the space where fear had tried to live. He looked toward the small office where Eleanor kept every important paper in neat folders marked by year. He thought of friends who honored their word. He thought of the community that had held them through storms. He straightened the sugar bowl, turned off the light above the sink, and moved toward the hallway with a steady step. They have underestimated their enemy. Silas spread old papers across Eleanor's kitchen table and smoothed the curled edges with his palms. The morning light came through the east window and laid a pale square over the wood, catching on paper clips and the glass bowl where Eleanor used to keep seed packets. There were folders marked by year in her neat handwriting, stacks of utility receipts, a copy of the deed that still smelled faintly of the file drawer where it had slept for decades. He sorted slowly, careful and methodical, the way he had taught Micah to measure a board twice before cutting once. Insurance, tax records, the survey map with a penciled note about the tree line, the deed with his and Eleanor's names side by side. He found Harold Thompson's old business card tucked behind a warranty from a contractor who had long since retired. The card was cream with blue ink, simple and sturdy. He could almost hear Harold's voice in the back of his mind, patient and clear as a river in winter, explaining things in plain language and never rushing anyone to a decision. Silas set the card at the top of the pile and placed a paperweight on it, as if it might blow away in a draft he could not feel. He stood a moment longer, letting the table tell him that he was not lost. Everything they had needed to protect had always lived right here, in this house. In these careful stacks Eleanor had kept like a promise. He dialed Harold's office. The receptionist answered with a voice that sounded like Main Street itself, steady and neighborly. She remembered him without being told, said Harold would move a few files and make time right after lunch. Silas thanked her and wrote the time on a notepad, even though he knew he would not forget it. He cleaned the table as if preparing for company, slid the documents into a single folder, and placed Eleanor's reading glasses on top. He had no need for them, but the ritual made him feel accompanied. He drove into town along the two-lane road where oaks arched from both sides and made a tunnel of green. The storefronts on Main Street stood like old friends in their Sunday best. The barber pole turned slowly. A diner put out a chalkboard with apple pie written in large loops. Flags hung from brackets on light poles, hardly moving in the mild breeze. Harold's office sat in a brick building with white trim and a brass bell on the door that gave a soft ring when he stepped in. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair pinned up gently, brought him a glass of water and asked how he was holding up. Silas answered honestly that some hours were heavier than others. She touched his forearm in quiet understanding and said Harold would be right with him. When Harold came out, he looked older at the temples, but his eyes were the same clear blue they had always been. He took Silas's hand in both of his and said he was sorry about Eleanor, said her kindness had made their town better in ways most people would never know. They sat in Harold's office among shelves of law books and framed photographs of ball games and church picnics. Sunlight fell across the rug and made a bright rectangle between them. Silas told the story with care, from the whisper he had heard at the cemetery to the morning's visit when an offer and a deadline had been placed like a trap on his kitchen table. He did not dramatize. He did not repeat the cruelest phrases. He simply laid out what had been said and the way it had made the air in his house feel thin. Harold listened without interrupting, then asked to see the papers. He read the deed, nodded at the tax receipts, and made a small sound of approval at the neatness of Eleanor's file labels. He asked a few questions to be certain there were no hidden liens and no missed payments. When he was satisfied, he leaned back and let out a breath, as if he had been holding it since Silas first walked in. He said there was no legal basis to force a sale. He said intimidation relies on the target being tired or afraid. He said the best defense, when the heart is tired and the mind is grieving, is to build a wall that cannot be pushed down. Silas asked what wall could be built. Harold folded his hands. He explained a path that was both simple and strong, a charitable transfer with a retained life estate. Silas would donate the property to a reputable foundation. He would hold the right to live there for the rest of his life, with full control over day-to-day use and maintenance. The charity would own the deed. Because of that, the house would be beyond reach of any family dispute, beyond reach of pressure, beyond reach of a quick sale engineered by someone else's ambition. Harold explained that this was not a trick. It was a tool meant for people who loved a place and wanted its value to honor something larger than themselves. Silas pictured Eleanor's roses, and the way she had tucked handwritten notes in their mailbox for neighbors who were ill. He pictured the oncology wing where they had held hands on long afternoons. He asked if a foundation focused on cancer research could be the place to receive a gift like this. Harold smiled then, a slow and genuine expression that erased years. He said he had a contact in Richmond at a nonprofit named Hope Against Cancer Foundation. He said they were well run and respected, and that people in their community had benefited from their work. He could call right now and set a meeting for the next day. He could also coordinate with their legal counsel to prepare the documents in a way that made everything clean and final. The relief that moved through Silas did not rush like a wave. It rose like warm water in a basin, steady and sure, reaching every place that had gone cold. He thought of Micah's deadline and felt it slip from his shoulders like a coat that did not fit. He imagined telling Eleanor that the house would protect others in her name, that there would be a garden there as long as he could tend it, and that the deed would carry her memory into work that fought the illness that had taken her away. They discussed details. Harold explained what to bring, how the appraisal would be handled, what the tax implications would be, and how the retained life estate would be recorded so that no clerk and no judge could mistake its meaning. Silas asked careful questions and wrote down each answer on a yellow pad Harold slid across the desk. When they stood, Harold placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, not as a lawyer but as a friend from the same church pews and Little League bleachers. He said this was the right thing. He said Eleanor would approve. Silas stepped back onto Main Street with the folder under his arm and Harold's promise in his pocket. The afternoon had brightened. He walked past the diner and nodded at the teenager wiping down the counter inside. A delivery truck idled near the hardware store, and the driver lifted 2 fingers in greeting. It felt like the town itself had set its shoulder beside him. At home, he returned the papers to the kitchen table and set a fresh page on the yellow pad. He made a list like he always did when a big job needed doing. Call Margaret at Hope Against Cancer Foundation. Gather utility statements. Find original appraisal. Pack lunch for the drive. Water roses before leaving. He checked the list twice and laid a pen across the top. Then he lifted Harold's card and studied the referral he had written in neat capital letters along the bottom. Hope Against Cancer Foundation, Richmond, Virginia. He picked up the phone and placed the call. The voice that answered was warm and professional. She offered her condolences, asked about Eleanor by name when he mentioned why this mattered, and scheduled a meeting for the following morning. When he hung up, the room felt larger, the ceiling higher, the window brighter. He poured himself a glass of water and drank slowly. The house seemed to set itself at ease around him. He tidied the table out of habit, squared the corners of the folders, and placed Eleanor's glasses gently back in their dish. Then he stood at the sink as evening settled in and watched a finch hop along the fence line, bright against the green. He whispered a promise to the quiet room that the home they built would live in service to love. He did not need to speak her name to know she heard him. He returned to the table once more, lifted the cream card, and held it between both hands. Silas looked at the business card for the charity in Richmond, feeling new hope. Silas left before the traffic built along the two-lane road toward Richmond. The morning sky was a soft gray blue, and the fields rolled out like a calm sea. He passed white fences and barns painted the color of good cherries, and he thought of Eleanor pointing out the foals each spring, her voice rising a little when she saw a tail flick or a clumsy trot. The thermos on the seat beside him sent up a steady coffee scent, and the deed folder lay under a wool cap as if tucked in for safety. He kept both hands firm on the wheel and let the road carry him toward a promise he hoped he could keep. The Hope Against Cancer Foundation stood near the medical district in a glass and brick building washed with clean light. Inside the lobby, framed portraits told quiet stories of survivors with the dates of their first clear scans written underneath in careful letters. A volunteer at the desk wore a name tag and a sunflower pin. She offered water and a kind word that did not ask for a reply. Silas sat for a few minutes on a bench polished by many visitors and looked at the photos until his breath matched the slow rhythm of the room. A door opened, and a woman with calm eyes and steady posture stepped out. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen and said she was grateful he had come. Her voice was warm without being sweet, the voice of someone who had stood beside a lot of hard news and learned how to make space for hope. She led him down a hall where the scent of lemon cleaner floated in a friendly way, and into a conference room with a window that framed a small courtyard. A man rose from the table and offered his hand. He said his name was David Rodriguez, and that he handled the legal work so families could focus on the meaning of their gifts rather than the paperwork. Silas placed his folder on the table and rested his palm on it for a second. He spoke Eleanor's name aloud and said why he had come. He told them he wanted their home to do some good in the world, and that he wanted to live in it until he was called to join his wife. He did not go into the details of threats and deadlines. He simply said he wished to protect something that had been made with love and to set it in service of the work that had tried so hard to save her. Margaret listened with her hands folded, not interrupting. David nodded once, then opened a thin file and spoke in plain language. He explained a retained life estate. He said Silas would sign a deed that gave the property to the foundation, while keeping the right to live there for the rest of his life. He said Silas would remain the person who tended the roses and chose the paint and brewed coffee in the kitchen with the east window, but that the title would move to a place where no pressure could reach it. He walked through the steps one by one. An appraisal, a few signatures, a filing with the county, a letter of thanks that was more than words, because the house itself would stand as a promise. Margaret slid a brochure across the table, but her words mattered more than glossy paper. She said the gift would fund patient support and research. She said families in the same waiting room Silas had known would feel the grip of fear loosen because someone had thought of them. Then she turned to the window and nodded toward the courtyard. She said they kept a small garden there for visitors who needed a quiet minute. If he wished, they could place a rosebush with a small plaque in Eleanor's name. The picture formed in his mind so clearly that his eyes began to sting. He saw bees drifting over pale petals and a bench with the shadow of leaves moving across its seat. He saw a woman pause there after an appointment and go back inside with her spine a little straighter. David reviewed the deed Silas had brought, checking the parcel number and the signatures from long ago. He placed a fresh document on the table. The paper was crisp and smelled faintly of the printer. Silas read each line. He asked a question about taxes, another about future repairs, and a last one about whether anyone could undo what he was about to do. David answered plainly. The house would be secure. It would be beyond reach. The right to live there would be as solid as the foundation itself. Silas picked up the pen. His hand did not shake. He wrote his name in the same careful hand he had used on the original deed, and then he set the pen down and pressed his palm to the table, feeling the grain through the paper. Margaret stood and took both his hands for a moment, a simple gesture full of respect. She said the foundation was honored and that they would carry Eleanor's name with care. She asked if he had a favorite phrase that captured Eleanor's spirit. Silas thought of her apron dusted with flour and the way she called through the screen door in summer. He said she believed kindness did not run out if you kept giving it away. Margaret smiled and said those words would sit beneath the rosebush when they planted it. They made copies and packed his folder neatly. David provided a letter confirming receipt and the terms of his life estate, something official that fit in the inside pocket of his coat like a small shield. Margaret offered to walk him through the courtyard. They stepped outside into the mild noon and stood among potted herbs and a bird bath where a sparrow flashed water from its wings. Silas pictured Eleanor's hand on his sleeve and the way she would have tilted her face to the sun even on a difficult day. The drive home felt shorter. The hills seemed to lift him rather than rise in his way. He passed a produce stand and saw a hand-painted sign for peaches, and he almost stopped out of pure gratitude that such a simple thing could still exist. When he pulled into his driveway, the maple shook down a little light and shadow, and the porch steps looked exactly as they had on 100 quiet evenings. He sat in the car for a moment and placed a hand on the letter in his pocket. The heat from his palm warmed the paper. The house in front of him was the same in every line and angle, and yet everything had changed. It was safe now. It was part of a larger good that would go on. Inside, he set the letter on the kitchen table and smoothed it with 2 fingers as if it were a tablecloth before company. He brewed fresh coffee and stood at the east window while it dripped. The roses lifted their faces after a light breeze and seemed to nod. He spoke softly into the room, telling Eleanor what had been done and what it would mean, describing a plaque with her words, describing a bench where someone might steady themselves before walking back into a doctor's office. He felt the house relax around him the way a body loosens its shoulders after carrying too much for too long. Then he rinsed the cup and placed it in the rack the way she liked, with a cloth draped over the edge so it would dry without spots. He walked to the small office and opened the drawer where Eleanor kept stationery. He took out a single sheet and wrote an invitation for dinner to Micah and Naomi, in a hand they would recognize at a glance. He kept the words simple and kind. He said there would be pot roast and pie. He did not mention papers. He did not mention deadlines. He sealed the envelope and set it by the door to mail on his afternoon walk. Late light stretched across the floorboards and warmed the photos on the mantel. Silas lit the porch light early and stood for a moment with his hand on the switch. The glow felt like a beacon and also like a boundary. He stepped back into the kitchen and folded a clean dish towel, setting it square on the counter. His breath was even. His shoulders were loose. He did not feel old. He felt ready. They think I am a helpless old man. Tomorrow they will learn otherwise. Micah and Naomi arrive for dinner, dressed like they're closing a business deal, not visiting family. The porch light glows against the early evening, and the scent of pot roast slips through the screen like a familiar song. Silas has set the table with Eleanor's good china and polished the flatware with a soft cloth the way she used to, small circles until each piece caught the light. A pie cools on the counter, the cinnamon and apple making the kitchen feel like a memory returned from a long trip. He breathes once, steady and slow, then opens the door. Micah steps inside with a firm handshake that has no warmth. Naomi surveys the room, her gaze landing on the hutch, the mantel, the antique clock, as if each item were a line on a spreadsheet. She compliments the smell without turning her head and sets her leather bag on a chair, as though it already belongs there. Silas takes their coats, hangs them neatly, and gestures them to the table. Hospitality is not a performance here. It is a tradition, and he means to honor it, even now. They eat with the same place settings used on graduations and birthdays. Silas serves generous portions, places the basket of rolls within easy reach, and asks after Micah's work, after Naomi's parents, after the commute. They answer briskly. Their words are smooth and tidy, like stones rubbed in a pocket. Naomi remarks that the neighborhood has shifted since last year, that zoning boards sometimes see what homeowners do not. Micah cuts the roast precisely and nods as if each slice proves a point. When the plates are mostly cleared, their voices settle into the groove he knew they would find. Micah mentions the apartment again, calling it a safe next step. Naomi notes the cost of a new roof, the inevitability of inspections, the time that slips past while a man insists on mowing his own grass. It is all said with clean edges. It is all meant to sound like care. Silas chews, swallows, and sets down his fork with care of his own. He speaks of Eleanor's roses in the back garden, of how the pink ones always opened first. He says the house faces east, the way she wanted, so that morning light reaches the kitchen window before it touches the porch. He says the Sunday dinners that began when Micah was small did not end when he went to college, that he and Eleanor kept cooking and setting plates, just in case, and that sometimes the door opened and sometimes it did not. He says these things without raising his voice. He does not argue. He lets the shape of the truth be enough. Naomi smiles and leans forward, the move of someone who believes she has found the seam in the wood. She speaks of change. She says love for a place can be preserved in photographs and in a smaller, more manageable space. She reminds him of the deadline. Micah's hand touches the leather folder at his elbow, as if to say everything needed is already here. Silas rises to bring dessert. The pie's golden crust sets down on the table with a soft knock that sounds like home. He slices carefully, places a piece before each guest, and pours coffee that fills the room with a new warmth. They eat. Naomi declares the pie perfect and says how lucky it is that the estate sale will attract buyers who appreciate handcrafted pieces. Micah adds that appraisers are standing by. The language becomes casual, almost cheerful, a plan already unfolding. When coffee cups are half empty and plates are crumb-dotted, Silas wipes his hands on a clean towel and walks to the small desk by the window. He opens the top drawer and removes a slim, crisp folder. The room is quiet except for the steady tick of the hall clock and the faint whir of the refrigerator. He returns to his chair and sets the folder on the tablecloth as if laying down a card in a game that requires full attention. Before we sign anything, he says, there is something you both need to understand. Naomi glances at her watch and lifts a brow. Micah opens his folder, pen ready. Silas flips his own folder open. The documents are clean and official, letterhead shining in the lamplight, seals pressed into paper like small firm footprints. He turns the top page so it faces them. The words are not theatrical. They are exact. He speaks them with the same care he used to read bedtime stories to a boy who once believed a house could hold every good thing. The house no longer belongs to me, he says. 3 days ago, I transferred it to the Hope Against Cancer Foundation, with the right to live here for the rest of my life. The room loses sound, as if someone has placed a glass dome over the table. Micah's pen stills above the signature line and then drops, clicking against the china. Naomi's smile does not fade so much as it empties, a light switched off behind her eyes. She reaches for the paper with 2 fingers and reads. Her mouth tightens. She reads again, slower, as if a second pass will rearrange the law. You cannot give away a house, she says, the sentence breaking across 2 breaths. There must be a review, a dispute, a judge to say this is not valid. Silas slides the letter confirming the transfer beside the deed. It states the appraisal, the parcel number, the county filing. It states his retained life estate in simple words that do not tremble. He adds a final page with the foundation's seal. He does not raise his voice. He does not lean forward. He lets the paper speak. Micah looks at his father as if seeing a stranger, then as if trying to find the boy he once was in his own reflection on the glossy table. He says the name of a council member as though names are keys that open any door. He mentions timing and leverage and other tools of people who think pressure is a way to measure truth. Then he goes quiet, because the facts do not bend. Naomi stands so fast her chair scrapes the floor. She says the word foolish and the word alone and warns that kindness is not what the world offers men who make choices like this. She looks around the room, but it is not a room you can shame. Every surface has been polished by years of use, and every picture frame holds a story that did not ask for her approval to exist. Silas does not ask them to stay for more coffee. He does not ask them to leave either. He gives them space to hear what they do not want to hear. He says the home they tried to move like a piece on a board now stands exactly where it belongs. He says the garden will be tended. He says the door will be unlocked for holidays should they come in good faith and with clean hands. He says he will be here as long as breath allows. Micah gathers his folder slowly, as though speed might break something that cannot be replaced. Naomi takes her bag and smooths her sleeve with a palm that does not tremble until it reaches the cuff. They walk to the door without speaking. The porch light lays a long band of gold across the threshold. Outside, the evening is mild and still. They do not turn back. Silas closes the door gently and stands with his hand on the knob until the quiet settles. He carries the empty coffee cups to the sink and rinses them the way Eleanor preferred. Warm water first, then a slow circle with the cloth so there are no streaks. He dries the china and returns each piece to its place. He straightens the towel, folds the tablecloth where a crease has softened, and breathes. He walks to the mantel and looks at the photo of Eleanor in her garden hat, one hand lifted to shade her eyes. The porch light sends a warm glow across the glass. He thinks of a rosebush in a courtyard in Richmond, a small plaque with words that once seemed ordinary and now feel like a cornerstone. He sets his fingertips lightly to the frame, not to hold on, but to honor what it holds. He sits at the table where the pie cools and the documents now rest in a neat stack. The house hums with the low music of evening. Somewhere out back, a cricket begins, and then another answers. He feels the strength that comes from doing what is right without shouting. He feels the ease of a promise kept. Then he lifts his eyes to the quiet room and speaks in a voice that is steady and sure. We protected our home, my love. As the evening closed on Silas's long journey, the image of him sitting quietly at his table remains vivid. The house was no longer a burden or a prize to be taken, but a promise kept, a legacy turned outward toward hope. What had begun with pressure, doubt, and the cruel assumption that he was powerless ended with the calm strength of a man who knew exactly who he was. The sound of the porch light humming in the dark, the gentle order of dishes returned to their place, and the memory of Eleanor's roses carried a stillness that spoke louder than any argument. The lesson woven through his story is clear. Dignity and truth do not need to shout. By standing firm, by protecting what was right without bitterness, Silas showed that even when the world measures you as small, you can answer with a courage rooted in love. In life, many will judge by appearances, dismissing quiet souls as weak or inconsequential. Yet time and again, it is often the overlooked neighbor, the soft voice, the person seated at the edge of the room who holds the wisdom and the strength to change the course of things. Like the lamp left glowing in a window, a single steady light can guide us through the deepest dark. So perhaps this story asks each of us, gently, to look again at those we might underestimate, and at ourselves when we feel dismissed. Real strength is not always loud, and justice does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes in the form of a simple signature, a quiet refusal to be moved, or the kindness of turning pain into a gift for others. Take a moment to think of the people in your life who seem small in the eyes of the world, but steady in heart. Their resilience might be the anchor you never expected. And if this story has touched you, let it remind you to carry that quiet strength forward. Share its warmth with someone who may be facing their own shadows, for a light passed from hand to hand can brighten even the longest night.